All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started with our webinar this morning. My name is Megan. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm a program coordinator with the Oregon Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. Before we get started with the webinar today, Tricia and I are going to go over a couple of logistics of the Zoom platform that we're going to be using, and then we'll pass it on over to our presenters.
All right, yeah, thanks everyone for coming. So for Zoom, if you have any questions at all, feel free to put it in the chat function, which should appear at the right, but there's a button towards the bottom of the video that says chat. You'll click there. Dalton and Monet will be able to answer throughout. If there's any tech questions that come up for you, feel free to message Megan. And then there's also closed captioning. So if you want closed captioning, there should be an option at the bottom on the right that says CC closed caption, and there's an arrow. You can click that and turn it on. Yeah, and then the recording or the webinar will be recorded and will be put up on our website afterwards if you want to check it out later. And after the webinar is done, we will send out a survey to get folks' input. I'm going to turn it over back to Megan.
Great, thanks, Tricia. So the Oregon Coalition, we are wicked excited to have with us Dalton and Monet from the Idaho Coalition, and they're going to be leading us through a webinar titled The 5 Elements of Youth Organizing to End Gender Violence. Dalton and Monet are both incredible leaders at the Idaho Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence, and we are very honored to learn from both of them today as they share their passion, experience, and insight for centering youth in the movement to end gender-based violence. So I'm going to pass it on over to the two of you.
Thank you, and welcome everyone to our presentation today. Really excited to have y'all. I'll introduce myself and then Dalton will introduce themselves and we'll get into it. So my name is Monet. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the legal advocate at the Idaho Coalition. I work with our legal team to provide free civil legal services to young folks who have experienced sexual violence. And then my other role is working with Dalton on our role in TA grants, where we help our member programs provide services to young people. And then we have 3 youth organizers on staff that we co-manage together. So yeah, that's a little bit about my role. And then I'll say a little bit about how I got into this work and why I care about gender violence. I'm a survivor of sexual assault, and I've had interpersonal violence in my family. And so, yeah, that's was my introduction into this work. And besides that, I really enjoy making bread. I have a book called, I think it's called Flour, Salt, Water, Yeast. I always get everything mixed up. But yeah, I make bread really frequently and pizza dough. It's one of my favorite things to do. And I just love cooking in general. I'm plant-based, so I really love experimenting with different things. And I'll pass it over to Dalton.
Thank you, Monet. Good morning, magandang araw, mayang buntag, everyone. My name's Dalton Dagondon Teagues. I am from the Philippines. I am currently a bilingual social change associate with the Idaho Coalition. As Monet said that I co-manage the youth program here. We provide technical assistance. And so I think Megan and Tricia will be giving our information out. So if you would like technical assistance on how to provide services to young people or things related to teen dating violence, you can reach out to Monet and myself, and we'd be happy to have a conversation or whatever presentation looks like for you. Another thing before I introduce myself more is so much gratitude to the Oregon Coalition, and also so much gratitude to the closed captioner Heidi. A part of the liberation or a part of liberation is making sure that all things are accessible to all people. And so closed captioning is one of those things that we also try to have at all places at our events. A little bit of myself. My introduction into gender-based violence is a story long before myself. As I've mentioned, I'm from the Philippines. Colonization is intricately connected to gender-based violence, as we have seen in Indigenous communities here. With that being said, I'm on Shoshone-Bannock lands, and so the Idaho Coalition is also situated on Shoshone-Bannock and Northern Paiute lands. Yeah, things about me. Other things I like to do are watercolors. I like taking pictures. I also recently rediscovered my love for running. Yes, watercolors. They're so soothing, and seeing how the water bleeds through the paper is calming when things move so fast in this work environment. Yeah, I'm gonna turn it over back to Monet to tell a little bit of story of today.
Yeah, so welcome to our presentation today. We choose All of Us Youth Organizing to End Gender Violence. We support a rising generation of social justice leaders and nurture sustainable approaches to organizing and community building. We Choose All of Us is a youth organizing campaign through the Idaho Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence. We are here to talk about all things youth-led and social justice and to lend y'all approaches for working authentically and intentionally with young people to interrupt harm and spark liberation. As a transition to our conversation, let's begin with 2 questions. So, what social movements were present when you were younger? And what did that movement sound like, feel like, taste like, look like? And I will model this, and then Dalton will read your responses in the chat. You can go ahead and throw those in there. So I think this was 2015. I was living in San Francisco at the time, and there was a Black Lives Matter rally happening kind of in the downtown area, right by where I lived, kind of like by the water. And I went with a friend of mine who also identified as a Black woman, and it sounded really loud. It felt like home. It tasted like salt water in the air, and it looked like freedom and my people. And so let's see, has anyone, Dalton, do you have any examples?
Yeah, I was an immigrant. I moved here in 2008. And so what I remember seeing on headlines was around when Occupy started. I didn't know what Occupy was, still don't quite know what it is. But but the vision, the thing that stuck out for me was like these people are really willing to put their bodies on the line and wanting like their vision for a clear future that they want to live into was something that they were willing to disrupt other people's lives, stand in the streets, stop people from going to work. And so that was one of the most critical moments, like that my consciousness started to change. The thing that was most present in my youth, which is not that long ago, was the Black Lives Matter organizing. Even within our organization, saying Black Lives Matter was pretty controversial. And so like I remember feeling tense walking into the office as a young person, because I was a young high school intern first with the Idaho Coalition, moved into college as a college intern, and then now as like an adult. An adult. And so I remember feeling tense around the office and walking around people, like trying to explain to our colleagues on the intricate connections between Black lives and gender-based violence. So that's a little bit of what I remember when I was young. Lindsay says, slut walk when I was in college, 2011 to 2015 for me. It was loud, vibrant, energizing, and also angry and revolutionary. Lots of women and some men. Yeah, so, and then Cassie said, efforts to end death penalty and protests at local prison. I remember a lot of flickering candles, sadness, and hope for something better, and a taste like bitter loss and confusion. Since I was younger, I had a very little concept of various forms of state-sanctioned violence. What we want to ask by this prompt is really think of yourself as a young person, and why the world matters to you. When you're a young person, things feel visceral, and to this day, I still feel visceral about certain issues. But really imagining what that first moment felt like. How can we replicate those for young people? How can we make sure that young people are still heard, are feeling like they're heard when we're working with them? The AIDS crisis was happening when I was a teen in the 80s. It was happening far away from me. I lived in a small rural town in Oregon. Oregon, Grants Pass, where there were no movements happening at a level or place that I as a youth was able to access. But I did look back on the 60s wishing I had been born so I could be involved. My first actual political event was a peaceful protest for OCA trying to pass anti-queer and trans legislation. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing. Cleveland, Jen from SAS, says, no blood for oil protests in early 90s, rhythmic and invigorating. Kendra Lardy says, when I was 19. Oh. Oh yeah, from the AIDS crisis. Thank you. Yeah, so we want y'all to like refresh on like why this movement matters to you and continually moving from that. Young people, we will talk throughout this presentation, love storytelling. And so as you tell stories of what happened in your generation, it builds rapport with young people.
Yeah, and then Pamela said, Columbus, Ohio, anti-war in Iraq rally. I felt clear, full of love and anger, hopeful and small. Yeah, thanks y'all for sharing.
Yeah, you can continue sharing in the chat, but I will talk a little bit more of the slide itself. So throughout the presentation, you'll see the pictures of slides of young people here in Boise and throughout the state who are mobilizing to end gender-based violence. You'll see in part of these presentations that there are multiple things that we show up for in our community. So specifically, this one is one of our youth activists named Olua Orbuki Ogunrinola. She's currently a student at Howard University, and so we're so proud of her. She's recently back and doing Black organizing for Black parent organizing here locally, which Monet can tell you more about. But this picture itself was taken at the We Choose All of Us / Women's March, that first one that happened here in Boise. It was super cold, it was sunny, lots of people wearing pink hats, which I still have a lot of questions about. And yeah, it was like a critical part to our political consciousness here in Boise, and the building of political solidarity. This is some of the things that we do at the coalition. We believe we have a collective responsibility to create the conditions for young people to move into leadership. Because while we want to believe that gender-based violence can end tomorrow, that's likely not going to happen. I don't think I will be seeing the end of gender-based violence. It's had since colonization and pre-colonization to exist within our communities, and it's going to take even longer, if not just the same amount of time for us to heal from those wounds and live in a world without gender-based violence. And then another thing I would like to preface is that our youth organizing didn't always look like this. And at the beginning, we had young people from dominant culture. We could talk about it later. And so this is actually a continuation of that. We're grateful for all the people that have been consultants and have coached us through this process. It's not a pretty process. It's not all sunshines and flowers. Monet and I are having difficult conversations with our young people right now, and we can share a little bit about that later. Yeah, 1 second, I'm blanking. Yeah, so our youth organizing started in 2015, and I've said that it started with children of lawyers and immigrants, not immigrants, lawyers and doctors. And so we had these really privileged young white kids who were well-meaning, and no shade to young white kids who come from privileged backgrounds. But when we're talking about centering the most marginalized within our communities, we're wanting to center those who are most impacted by gender-based violence. And so while these kids might have experienced, or these privileged kids might have experienced gender-based violence themselves, our liberation is intricately connected to what we conceptualized as a last girl at this moment. So the last girl is not necessarily a girl within our community, but a person who experienced the most amount of barriers to their liberation. We believe that if we provide our services or shape our youth program to cater to the last girl or the person who experiences the most amount of barriers to their liberation within our community, then the services that we provide and our youth organizing will be made accessible to everyone within our communities. It started in 2005, and then in around 2008-ish, our executive director, Kelly Miller, went to the Move to End Violence, and she's a cohort number 2. And that's when we began our personal transformation about what it means to center people from historically marginalized communities. And so even our staffing changed internally, how we interact with each other has changed. And then eventually it trickled down into our youth organizing. And then around 2015, 2014-ish is when we actually started deliberately recruiting young people from historically marginalized communities. And then we could talk a little bit more about how it evolved from 2015 to here in the next few slides. Next slide, please.
Great. So now we're going to get into the details of youth organizing. And in the chat here, I'm going to put our meaningful access guide to serving underserved rural youth. So hopefully that works for y'all. And basically this guide just gives you some overview of why we focus on historically marginalized youth in rural communities, and just a little bit about Idaho too. We are based out in Boise, which is the only urban county in the state. All the other counties are considered to be rural, so the state is pretty much rural to the core. Just to give you an idea of the landscape here. And so youth organizing is a really untapped resource in the movement for liberation. There's such a power in youth organizing historically and today. And I think before, youth organizing was more siloed. I think adults didn't want to overstep. They didn't want to be ageist. And so they were kind of off in their corner, and then youth really wanted youth-only spaces, understandably so. But I think more today, there is definitely a more multi-generational approach, multi-generational partnerships, and it's really shifted more to co-creation with adults and youth. And so the 5 elements that we're going to focus on today in youth organizing are number 1, intergenerational base building to connect power across communities. Number 2, transformative youth leadership. Number 3, embody collective practices for wholeness, healing, and resiliency. Number 4, transformative campaigns. And number 5, movements interconnected across issues, which Dalton has already kind of laid out. And so by using these elements, we find ways to end gender violence, interconnected to multiple systemic oppressions, and all the ways we devalue and dehumanize communities. And we can go to the next slide. And I'll pass it over to Dalton to talk about the first element.
Ooh, sorry. Can we go back to the last slide? I just want to recognize the person that was on there. This is Alyssa. They're also a Black organizer here in Boise, and they used to be a part of our youth program as well. Now they're organizing Black Mutual Aid here in Boise, which Monet also knows more about. But this was for March for Our Lives in, I think it was around a year ago, where young people decided to walk out of school to the State House legislature to urge them to have more strict gun laws, so that their lives are safe in schools. But yeah, Alyssa's great. They're an amazing organizer here in Boise. They're younger than me, but I still learn so much from them today. And then next slide, please. So element 1, as Monet said, is intergenerational base building to connect power across communities. We kept it simple to 5 at the advisement of our consultant named Norma Wong, because if we have any more than 5, she said, people will not remember, which is probably really true. So the intergenerational base building, as I mentioned, is a partnership with young people and utilizing them at being the most ready for social movements within our communities. While young people are wise and capable of directing their own lives within their movements, we think it's also valuable for us to have an intergenerational partnership so that our elders within our communities, which is a traditionally indigenous practice where we still value our elders' wisdom and vision, like their experience in fighting the opposition would be helpful for young people to know so that young people can navigate. The thing is, we also need young people as much as we need young people, we also need elder people, but we also need the people that are in between. And so this was the structure of our youth activist network that we had 2 years ago. In the youth activist network, we had about 40 young people from across the Treasure Valley who were interested in different kinds of activism. But one thing that they were organizing around was ending gender-based violence within our movement. And so the young people weren't really willing to listen to our elders within our community. And at that point, our elder was Kelly Miller, our executive director. She doesn't like being called an elder because, like, who does? And so there's a disconnect between the language that young people speak to our elder. Like young people at least Gen Zers, within my experience, don't like to send emails. And so, but the directions from our director and like with the parameters of their projects were coming through emails, and they were not willing to read their emails. And so that comes, and so there's a role for Monet and myself to be able to bridge the two generations, so that we can speak the young people language, kind of. But even though now I'm like only 23, I'm losing young people's language really quickly, because language moves really fast, and like it's hard for me to stay relevant. So sometimes we still have to lean on our young people to explain not their lingo, but like the things that are relevant to them. And so also code switch for young people, so that our executive director understands, not that she's malintent of like not understanding young people, but we can give more context about certain things that they would want and need within their communities to organize. So we think about it as like a visual ladder. Like there's young people at the bottom, and then there's me and Monet in the middle, and then not hierarchical either, but like our elders there are fewer elders than there are young people. And we can talk about how we can move faster as an intergenerational partnership than just one people or just young people alone. Specifically, like young people don't have access to money. And so it's important for myself and Monet to work with our funders, to work with our elders in our community who are retiring, who do have the money, and direct those funds to the young people and within their communities. Next slide.
Yeah, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, but I think it's also important to advocate for young people to get paid for the work that they do, and not just do like an internship or to get experience. It's really important to pay people for the important work that they're doing. So I'll talk a little bit about centering youth from historically marginalized communities. This is really important to the Idaho Coalition. And when I mean historically marginalized, we have, specific groups in mind, just really quickly, like Black, Indigenous youth, Latinx youth, youth of color, youth with disabilities, LGBTQ plus youth, youth that come from immigrant families, refugee families. Hopefully I haven't missed anything, but that's what we mean when we say historically marginalized. So we need to have more than just space for these communities. We need to have meaningful value and support for them too. So when we work with youth from historically marginalized communities, we need to make sure that we're showing up for them without expecting them to just show up for us. As this is especially true because youth already face sexual assault and domestic violence at higher rates, and marginalized communities face sexual assault and domestic violence at higher rates. So if you could just close your eyes and imagine, what are resources that youth might need for this work? And what might young people need to thrive in these spaces? And you can throw some of your ideas in the chat and we can read those. And I'll go over some of the things that we prioritize. So first, listen and learn. What do we mean by that? We give them our attention and we ask them what they need. And I see that Pamela said transportation, which I was going to go over. Kendra said funding. Yeah, so with transportation, some examples of that could be if they're required to be at an event or at a meeting, making sure that wherever it's at is accessible by a bus line, maybe a carpool situation, or get them a Lyft or an Uber. With funding, funding to get them resources, to make sure that they're able to go to trainings and things like that. Amber said a space to meet and plan, people to hear their problems, money to put actions in place. And then Cassie said harm reduction, support if and when they make mistakes, modeling by adults of compassionate communication, encouragement of boundaries. Yes to all of those things. That's great. I will say a space to meet and plan, you know, because of COVID, things have really shifted dramatically, and we're all virtual now as mostly virtual as a staff. And I'll talk a little bit later about some of the challenges around that. But typically, yes, we would meet in the office and have a space for them, and snacks, food is so important. We say food is love, providing snacks that they like, not just breath mints. And then Kendra said access to places where decisions get made. Yes. I would say one example of that would be, you know, having a youth on your board. That would be one example. We do not have a youth on our board. It's something that's always an ongoing conversation. And then Eli said reliable internet in rural areas. That is something that is a huge struggle. We talk with our programs about all the time. Some of the other things to keep in mind are timing of events. When youth are in school throughout the year, it's important to keep in mind, you know, when are your staff meetings? Are they during the school class time? Are they during the evening and the weekends when they're a little bit more accessible? Other things around accessibility are language of your flyers, things like that. Childcare, providing childcare for them. And then, like I said, paying them for the work that they do is really important. And yeah, I think that covers it. And we can go to the next slide. So what kind of leadership do we expect from youth? And which youth are we thinking of when we think of, or when we think about youth leaders? And I can put these questions in the chat too. So yeah, what kind of leadership do we expect from youth, and which youth are we thinking of when we think about youth leaders?
Yeah.
Youth who are outgoing. Yep, brainstorming the future that they envision. Their input to keep the organization progressive. Yep, that's great. Youth who recognize the strengths of their peers. Yeah, that's one of the first questions I like to ask is, what are your strengths? What do you think your strengths are? Engaging all youth, finding avenues that work for their leadership strengths beyond leadership classes. And communicative. Yes, communication has been a struggle recently. Any youth can be a leader. Have youth be a part of deciding what makes a, quote, good leader.
Yeah. So as you're still typing those in the chat, the reason why we asked this question is we think of traditional youth leaders as people who are outgoing and people who have dominant norm skills. What I mean by that is that they're able to read and write and speak in public and speak in a way that they're heard by adults. While these young people exist and they're great, these are usually the type of young people that people think of when they're hiring young people to be a part of their youth program. What we will also encourage y'all to do is hire young people who don't have these skills. There are also other skills available to us that still model youth leadership, like artists are one. They not necessarily want to be out in the open, being talked to by adults and being asked questions about how gender-based violence is impacted in their communities, but they can illustrate what gender-based violence looks like in their communities. And that's still a type of leadership that we would want and value within our communities. There are also young people who are healers and space holders of space. So what we have here in the picture is the Youth Activist Network, where we usually sit in circle because we want them to feel like they're not in a classroom, which is a lot more difficult now that now that they're actually using Zoom and they're interacting with us through this interface. And so it's hard for us to make sure that we can distinguish between school and something that is more nourishing for them. So Angela said, youth can play a vital role in marketing. Yes, computer savviness is one. Yeah, not all of the digital organizers ever want to talk in public either. As we've learned, our tech people don't want to talk public in either. So, but we still need their leadership in navigating the internet. And then Lindsay says, youth who recognize oppression. Yes, yes, yes. So storytelling, young people who are able to tell their stories of gender-based violence or like how they want to live in a world without gender-based violence. Those are powerful young leaders as well. And I really, you only need one young person who can talk to adults, but you need a variety of young people with multiple skills, with varying comfort with the public to make a youth organizing program work, because gender-based violence requires all of these skills for us to encourage our community to move towards the world without gender-based violence. So in addition to the Youth Activist Network, this is and the 5 elements of youth organizing, we were able to produce the meaningful access to providing services to youth from historically marginalized communities and rural communities. That's not what it's called. I don't know why we call things very adult things. But some of the things that we want to make sure to meaningfully access and provide services to young people is to understand and practice co-creation, interrupt habits of adultism, interrupt habits of white supremacy and dominant culture, and new practices to adapt. One of the practices that we like to adapt in our youth activist network, like here, is sitting in circle and practicing wholeness. Young people don't need to perform. They are at this place in their life where they're like, yeah, I'm tired of pretending that I'm okay. I'm tired of pretending in school that I have to pay attention when there could be bigger issues than just school performance itself. We encourage that with our youth activist network, and we are still trying to navigate that with our young people today. We understand, sorry, my cat wants to be a part of this presentation as well. We encourage that with all our young people. If they're upset, totally fine. But we always check in with the young people who seem to be a little bit more reserved, who are sitting too back with the things. It could be also help-seeking behaviors and what they want, or like what they might be needing something from us within as facilitators of the space. Another practice that we are doing is practicing multiculturalism, multiracial, and radically inclusive environments. I'm gonna put my cat outside my door, 1 second. And so what we mean by that is making sure that if we have young people whose English is not their first language, we speak slowly, not dumb our language down, so that they can understand and have honest conversations. And we hope to have the same thing with y'all. If y'all need us to slow down, or if you have any questions, feel free to stop us at any point in the chat. Another thing too is making sure that all spaces are physically accessible for people who move differently throughout the world. So some people move in a chair, some people use canes to move about. And so making sure that there are spaces like here on the left side of this picture, we had some young people that were moving throughout with a chair. And so they weren't there at the present, but making sure that they can just move up without having to ask for space, literally asking for space in a circle of storytelling. Another thing too with multiracial communities is that can look like food. Young people love food, and like Domino's is great and problematic, but like we can't just be serving young people, white people food all the time. It has to be food that's represented from all cultures within those communities. So ask the young people what they want to eat. It makes, but still making sure that their dietary restrictions are still met. I would encourage y'all to support more local family-owned businesses as well when you're considering about buying food for young people. Habits of intergenerational approaches, we talked about that, and then habits of adultism. Yes, we still struggle with this as well at the Idaho Coalition, and we're certainly not saying that we're the best at it. So we still tokenize our young people and then ask them to be in presentations that they had no idea that was happening. We still do all of those things, and we still trying to find meaningful work for young people. Like office space work is great, and it gives them hours and things like that, but it was not necessarily things that are skills that would contribute to their development as young leaders within our community. I remember when I was a young person in the office or in high school at our old office, I was a paid intern at that point because they were starting to pay our interns. And then I was fixing the back office and making sure that the supplies are all neat, because people just go in there, as most back offices do, take and then not put it back to how they neatly found it. Someone walked by me and says, "Oh, you're lucky to be able to just do that." And I was like, "Oh, okay. Do you want to do it?" So I asked this person. So like finding those meaningful interactions with young people, but also realizing that there's work that's not necessarily the most fun. What I mean by that is like sometimes phone banking is necessary. Sometimes sending out text to your network is necessary. And those are things that are not as fun to organizing as anyone who's ever phone banked, but are still necessary and not necessarily fun for young people as well. So other things that we do, we try to cultivate is habits of spaciousness. I am terrible at this, and I know everyone in the nonprofit sector is also terrible at this, because the narrative that we're told ourselves is to continually produce something so that we can maintain a good relationship with our funders. That's not necessarily a practice of spaciousness. We practice spaciousness because if we hurry young people through an agenda, they're not going to have time to have more real conversations to us about what they really need from us in their communities. We don't want to have to like set aside a time of like, hey, everyone's messed up recently and things feel tense. But like, as those problems are coming up, young people should be able to tell us that those problems are coming up as they're happening. We've done several things wrong in the past, and so now we're having to have more difficult conversations with our young people that we wish could have been taken care of sooner. But because our habits of spaciousness, we didn't live in a spaciousness, young people felt like they had to hold on to it until the right moment. Another thing in spaciousness that we practice is breathing. In a few slides down, we'll be practicing breathing to show connection to the body. Young people are whole people themselves too. They're not just the production or the things that they produce, in the same ways that we are not reflective of our work, or we're not reflected by the things that we produce. And so they need to be connected to their mind, body, and spirit as well to be able to develop into healthy adults. Connection to each other is another way. We encourage young people to do storytelling and to listen to each other in storytelling. Nourishment, as I mentioned, young people love food. They go throughout the day, and most young people throughout the day only have one meal throughout the day. By the time they get to your place around 4 or 5 p.m., they're getting hungry. Their bodies and minds are developing. They use a lot of their brain power throughout the day. And so for us to expect young people to perform on an empty stomach is something that's unrealistic. We also try to provide all of our youth activist network gatherings extra food so that young people who are experiencing food insecurity can take it home with them after. We always want feedback from the young people about what food they want, but also try to think about what's food that's actually nourishing. Like gummy bears are delicious and young people will ask for them, but does it mean, is it something that's nourishing? Will they is it something that will nourish their bodies on the longer terms? So we try to do a balance of both. We try to order pizza, but also like hummus, little hummus packaging so that they can take it home. High in protein things that are both vegetarian, vegan, and if people eat meat, they can eat meat, that they can also take home. So circle again is super important for us because it allows young people to not feel a hierarchy. We never want to just really talk to young people directly, like in a classroom. They'll automatically turn off and shut off and not engage in the ways that we want them to be authentic and move throughout the world that way. Art supplies. In a dominant culture classroom, we encourage young people to sit still and focus on the speaker at all times. That's not necessarily how people learn. So art supplies are there for young people to process their emotions. We give them journals at the beginning so that they could just journal, not even things related to the Youth Activist Network, but like to encourage them to get their emotions and process their emotions. Their prefrontal cortex is still developing at this time in their life. And so they're still trying to fight their lizard brain from just like lashing out and like having erratical behavior, which is totally fine as well. Those are perfectly fine trauma responses. But if we want young people to be their whole selves, we need to either give young people enough time to process and share those experiences. And sometimes that process looks like them doodling on pieces of paper while we're talking directly to them. If I assume like if they want to remain engaged, they're going to ask questions. And I don't make any assumptions about how young people learn differently. Again, we want this to be a radically inclusive space. So one thing that we are well aware of is young people have developmental disabilities or learning disabilities. And all of those are and I'm not a trained professional to catch those either. So like, I don't make any assumptions when working with young people that way. Another practice that we do is also collective reading. I was actually just a part of a queer book club that we facilitated, but some of the young queer folks on that book club say they hang out over Zoom or over Instagram and read to each other. And I think about how tender collective reading and reading to each other is, because the last time I've been read to was when I was very young. Like how intimate of a practice that is to just have someone read to you. And that is a form of connection. We expect young people to read and write, but we never expect young people to read and write for each other. And so in what that looks like in Circle, it can look like reading a collective poem. So we read collective poems all the time as a way to ground young people, but also get young people to a place where their minds and hearts are are in sync. We have a We Choose All of Us poem somewhere. I could drop the link later. But in closing, we also want to honor young people's time. So like young people need to catch the bus. So we always make what we call an artificial stop for young people that need to catch the bus. But young people are also welcome to hang out for another 30 minutes. And hanging out after the event is one of the more important parts for me as a facilitator, so that we make sure that young people are able to find ways home. So even if their ride falls through, I definitely do not want to leave them at my building, outside of my building, because I have to lock up. That doesn't feel good to me as a youth organizer. And concerns of safety is something also very real. The other reason I wait for young people about 30 minutes after is like sometimes they're not comfortable yet talking in front of all of the other young people that you're having facilitations with. This gives them a more intimate time to talk to you as direct service providers or as youth organizers about things that they might be experiencing. One thing that I've also experienced, that it might take multiple conversations, because young people like to do this thing where they're testing you. They're not testing you as to see if you're a good person or not. They're testing you to see if you're a person that they can build trust and rapport with. The other thing that I'm fully transparent with, and I don't know how it operates in Oregon, is everyone in Idaho is technically a mandated reporter. And so when I think the conversation with that young person is going to be something, a disclosure or something about or something that they've experienced in terms of gender-based violence or something like that, I like to take a pause and say, to maintain their agency, because like what we know of survivors is that agency is one of their best ways, or reestablishing agency is one of their best ways towards healing. And if we take away that agency, that young person's not going to be able to trust us again. And that young person, once you tell them that you're a mandated reporter, might take a few more days, if not ever, to say like, this is something that happened to me, and to build that trust again with them. So that's another thing that I would really encourage y'all to do, have a better relationship with young people around your mandated status, mandated reporting status within your state. I don't know what that looks like in Oregon though. Interrupt business or overextension, as I mentioned earlier. This is something that I learned from youth organizing across the United States. We were part of this youth summit and gathering young people in DC, 400 young people in DC for this week-long summit. And one of my colleagues, Cheyenne, who's also a youth organizer, said, why do we why are we in this violence, or like, why are we in the anti-violence field when we still commit violence to our bodies? And that one shook me to my core. Because like, if I really do want to live in a world without violence, I need to stop committing violence in myself and habits of overextension. What I will say is what I've learned from my Zen teacher is that the opposition wants us to be tired. The opposition wants us to feel constant panic, because when we're in constant panic and constant tiredness, we're the most vulnerable to their attacks. And so committing violence against myself through habits of overextension is not just like a self-preservation kind of thing, because if we burn out, that's one less person moving towards the liberation of all peoples. Burning out is at all costs has to be avoided, and we have to start that and instill that in young people today. Young people are really good at modeling this with each other. They're really good at passing responsibilities to each other, saying that I can't show up in this way today. And it was really modeled by one of our young people recently, who was experiencing a lot of health complications, but then asked another young person that we've experienced, or another young person who's perfectly capable of facilitating the event that night, to just take on that event. The young person still did really well. And so that's another thing why we want to stop siloing young people for their skills, is because young people want to share their lived experiences and their skills with each other. Any questions about that? Because I'm gonna keep talking. I'm a great talker, y'all. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna read what Pamela said. I am a confidential advocate, fortunately. Thank you so much for sharing all this info. Oh, they have to hop off. But I was also going to throw some things in the chat to avoid doing, which, like Dalton said, we still make mistakes with our youth organizers all the time. It's definitely always a learning journey. But I'll throw some of those things in the chat to share with y'all. And you can go ahead, Dalton.
Thanks, Monet. So one thing that that's really important to our transformative youth leadership process is experiential learning. Again, we really try to interrupt habits of how young people learn within the classroom. Like, I can tell these young people that violence or like the habits of competition and habits of capitalism is something that's inherently toxic to our communities. Or we can have young people experience what that looks like in our activities. So one of the things that we also invest in is futurism in transformative youth leadership. So there's this city building activity where we give young people supplies of paper, scissors, pens, felt, a bunch of other random things that we find in the office. And we distribute those in little paper bags and separate the young people into 4 corners in the room. What we don't tell them is that they don't all have the same supplies. Some people don't even have tape. Some people don't have paper. And we want them to build a city that they want to live in. And so, and that is some of the cities that we live in today. So what we ask them is to build the city that they want to live in the future. And we said, you have 30 minutes to build the city. We didn't tell them anything else. By just putting them into 4 corners, the young people started competing in terms of making the city. They started getting heated. Some young people formed a little wall, I was like, whoa, around them because they didn't want the other groups to see that they had more resources, which I still think about today because they noticed that they had more resources. So they had formed a wall of people so that the other teams didn't know that they were unfairly advantaged. And so one of the groups entirely just like didn't participate because they couldn't build the city. And they started catching on that everyone didn't have the same amount of resources. And then we had the young people explain to us what they built at the end. And then we started asking them questions about like why they didn't collaborate. Instead, they reverted back to habits of dominant culture, of competition, working in isolation, and like literally hiding what resources that they have when they could be building a more beautiful city when they're sharing all of their resources and all of their skills together. So when we think about when we say experiential learning, this is the kind of experiential learning that we want to change in the mindsets of young people. Sorry, I thought the chat was... So we could have told young people, hey, don't compete with each other. But the fact of the matter is that when these, and we still do this as adults and people who are working towards liberation, we, at moments of times in crisis, it is always important to revert back to our core values and what that means within our communities, so that we don't revert back to dominance of practices of dominance culture. Like, these young people are all in alignment with each other. They all want to move towards a world without gender-based violence. But as the minute that they thought it was a competition, like, they literally discarded each other as friends, and that, like, they didn't hurt each other's feelings, but they discarded each other's like personal relationships. And this was 6 months into our youth program. Similarly, I wish we could model similar behaviors to the young people today. I'm a firm believer that young people can still teach us several things, several skills and also lessons that we need to learn and remind ourselves daily. And so another thing that we also try to practice is consistent support. So this is something that we're still trying to figure out, and it causes me to stay up late at night. So thinking about youth organizing as two different models. So there's one that's youth leadership, and one there's youth organizing. Youth leadership is like what I think about, like shaping young people, versus youth organizing, like letting young people do what they want, which is fine as well. Both are fine. But how do we meld and give young people skills so that they're able to do both within their communities, like as exceptional young leaders in themselves? Like, we don't want to coddle young people either, but we want to rely on their strength. So what does it look like when young people are telling us that they don't feel a certain way, but also we've given them opportunities? And this is a kind of conversation that we're having with our young people currently. And what, like, how can I hold them accountable to things that they've said that they didn't want previously, but now that they want? So like, how do I do that as a facilitator and as a person who's caring for these young people? Monet, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think in addition to that, the challenge has been around just general communication. And, you know, we had a conversation with them and basically facilitated it in a way of like, okay, what is your feedback for us? And then we'll give you feedback, and then we can have a conversation. And yeah, it felt like they were just, I guess, we weren't really getting answers from them in all the ways we were reaching out. And I think, like, for example, email, text, you name it, we were trying it, and it was just really not working. And I think it's important to keep in mind that with the coronavirus and with them starting school recently, we kind of knew that might happen. It was expected, but at the same time, it just felt like we were completely disconnected from them. And I think it was a mix of their work has dramatically changed. school has dramatically changed. There's just a lot of changes for everyone that it's just really hard to adjust to. And so I think just having that open dialogue of feedback and also offering that if they don't want to give feedback in that moment, they can email us, they can text us individually. It doesn't have to be a group conversation. Just giving those options of various ways to give feedback that works for them. And I think while not all of our, challenges have been solved, I think that we are going into the right direction with having that open dialogue. And I think what helps is just keeping in mind that we're all going to make mistakes, and just like setting those expectations and those boundaries, kind of like a reset of like, okay, we expect you to communicate with us, whatever that looks like for you, that's great. But we do need to have that communication and sort of modeling that for them. Which I think someone had mentioned that earlier. Cassie had mentioned, like setting boundaries and just sort of like modeling behaviors for youth. This is really important because they do look up to us, and especially as Black and people of color, our youth are pretty diverse, and I think that they do look up to us for leadership. Yeah, I think that was most of it.
All right, thank you so much. Next slide, please.
All right, so cultivating inner wisdom, generative power, and skills. As part of transformative leadership, we believe everyone has wisdom and value needed for successes. Everything we need is within us, we're guided, and we can find common language to generate power. We already talked a little bit about the challenges. I do want to talk about some of the successes that Dalton had alluded to earlier around Black community organizing here in Boise. So the first thing is that we meaning me, another Black staff, Ty Simpson, and Alyssa, our former youth organizer, we all collaborated to, apply for this Black community organizing grant. Alyssa actually approached us about this grant and wanted to have the Idaho Coalition sponsor, and then have me and Ty kind of as not supervisors, I don't want to say that word, but just kind of like guiding them through the process. But this was totally like Alyssa's dream about having a Black mutual aid situation here in Boise. And so me and Ty spent time with Alyssa applying for this grant. And hopefully we hear in November that we got it. But it's just an example of that intergenerational approach of having Alyssa, who's a little bit younger, who was a former youth organizer and is still an organizer in the Black community here. And then me and Ty being a part of the Idaho Coalition as staff, working together to make sure that the Black community here is taken care of, and that we sort of facilitate a community where people feel like they can have their voice heard and have the things that they need to thrive. And then the other thing is the Black Parenting for Liberation group, and the book is called Parenting for Liberation: A Guide for Raising Black Children for Black, African, and African American Families. And so we got copies of the book, and any Black, African, or African American parent that wanted the book, we could give it to them for free, and we delivered it to them through the Idaho Coalition. And so Alyssa was on that, Buki was on that, and then some other staff a former youth organizer, Jennifer. They all did that. And then there is going to be a virtual conversation with the author to discuss how to practice liberation in Black, African, and African-American homes, which is awesome. And so that was, I mean, that's definitely needed in the community. And it was also a way for our young people to contract with us and make some money, and also be a part of that Black community organizing here. So those are some of the successes that we've had recently in terms of specifically Black community organizing, which I'm part of here. And so, yeah, that's just some examples of that intergenerational work that can be done. And we'll go to the next slide. And so element 3 is collective practices to nurture youth wholeness, healing, and resilience. So Dalton talked about this a little bit earlier, but at the coalition, we do a lot of breathing work, movement work to ground us before meetings and events. It's something that is truly a practice here. And I have to admit, when I first came to the coalition, my first staff meeting, I walked in and everyone was like, what I'm about to show you that we're all going to do together. And I was like, what is this? This is like totally out of my element. I was so confused because no one had even explained it to me. And I was honestly pretty resistant to it. But it's something that I actually, I think it's really important to do now. And I do enjoy it. So we are going to do some movement work together. This is called Mountains, Clouds, Waterfalls. And I will do the standing version and Dalton will do the sitting version. And so if you're sitting in the chair, make sure that your feet are grounded. And then if you're standing, kind of just do like a relaxed stance. Bend your knees a little bit. And then we're gonna start with mountains, clouds, and then waterfalls. And so the mountains, you're gonna breathe in and move your hands up like you're forming a mountain. And then on the way down, you're gonna breathe out. And then you'll go to the other side, form the mountain and breathe in. And then come down, breathe out. So we'll do this just for a minute. Breathe in, breathe out. And you'll just look to the horizon with a soft gaze. And we'll do a couple more. And then we'll move to clouds. So you'll hold your hands like this, kind of like you're holding a cloud. And you'll breathe in. And then as you move your body this way, you'll breathe out. And then you'll switch. Breathe out. Breathe in. Breathe out. You're still looking to the horizon. We'll do a couple more of these. All right, and then the last one is waterfall. I have to move my stuff here. If you're standing, you'll put your right foot forward and you'll move your arms like this, up, breathe in, and then on the way down, you breathe out. Then you do it on the left side, breathe in, bring your arms up, breathe out. Do a couple more. All right, so those are, then we do that in a loop. Mountains, clouds, waterfall, mountains. Typically before a staff meeting or any sort of event that we're having, we do it virtually too. And so my question is, how does everyone feel right now? How does your body feel?
And as people are typing, yeah, I could talk a little bit more of the breathing. So when we breathe, we're taught to breathe from our chest to make our bellies feel smaller. This is also a gendered thing too. So when we think about gender-based violence, it's still connected to it. When we stand up, or people who are standing, like men or mass folks tend to like squat and like take up as much room as possible, but femme folks and people who are socialized as women take a smaller stance. What we want people to learn is like there's a happy medium between the two, so that there's not men who are taking up so much space in public or sitting in public transportation with manspreading, but also like we can't encourage femme folks to be powerful if they're literally making themselves smaller within our communities. And so we encourage that from all of our youth activist network you see here, who are doing all the breathing practices. So Jen says, relaxed. Kendra says, thank you for sharing that. I feel grounded and calm. And then Megan said, connection between my head and my body. Thank you for trying that on. I know trying this on with young people, as Monet said, is something that the young people, they're like, what the fuck is going on? And so it took a couple of tries before they started practicing with us. But yeah, eventually they all loved doing it.
And like I said, I was also like, I don't even, what is this? But I appreciate it now.
So in full transparency, we're supposed to end-ish around 12 or 11:30-ish your time. And so I'm gonna buzz through the next couple slides, which are also important, but like to me, not the part of the work. And then at 12:30, we're gonna take a pause for your human needs, or 11:30 your time, because we're an hour ahead. And then we'll leave it open up for questions for the last 20-ish minutes, if that's okay. Monet, do you want to talk about element 4 in the next slide on stories of the future?
Yeah, so transformative campaigns. I'm going to put our website in the chat. You can find some of our campaigns there. We have quite a few. But I'll talk a little bit about Stories of Our Collective Future. Each year, it's an intergenerational collaboration of youth and adults creating transformative campaigns to interrupt the root causes of violence and to create new cultural norms and ways of being. Typically, we would have this in person. In the past, it's been in person where we pick a theme and youth submit their poetry and we read through them, and then we pick some winners for various prizes, and then we I guess publish a book of all the poetry, which is really, really cool. This year we did a virtual version of that back in April or May, before people were like totally zoomed out. But yeah, the youth who had some of the winning poetry, they got to say it in front of their peers and other folks who had written poetry, and it was really amazing and powerful. And yeah, we can go to the next slide.
So cultural transformations and stories of our collective future. The Stories of Our Collective Future campaign reflects on what we believe that will move us into an emergent worldview and radically transform systems around us. We see it as like radically changing someone's point of view is not going to happen in one conversation. We've tried to do it on social media. I've tried to do it on social media, trying to get conservative members of my family to understand that gender violence exists within all communities. It's just not going to happen. And so we try to think about our cultural transformational campaigns as the soft touches that we can distribute throughout the rest of our state. And so it's not necessarily one conversation that we're having, but like asking young people and planting the right seeds of questions like, hey, is a different world possible within our lifetime? And is it possible to do that with the people that are around me? And so our dropping the link in here onto our this year's Stories of Our Cultural Transformation. But like the themes of this year with Christy C. Rhodes as our artist. If you know who Christy is, they're an amazing artist, Cuban-American artist, super feminist art, but the art is centered, our campaign was centered around healing. What does our collective future look like? What does resilience look like within our communities? And these are very specific questions that we want to ask young people, but we used to have campaigns that were scare tactics. There will be like 1 in 4 young people will be sexually assaulted throughout high school, or X population will be assaulted before high school. And this doesn't really engage young people in really the conversations that would take to end gender-based violence tomorrow. 1, because it scares the hell out of them when we're talking about sexual violence. And also, we're trying to connect our movement to different parts of the movements, or different movements like environmentalism, gender justice, and reproductive rights, and all of these other things. So when we're talking, so we deliberately changed the conversation to not avoiding gender-based violence, but like all the conversations that are adjacent to gender-based violence, to make it more acceptable, or to make it more accessible to young people when they're discussing it with their peers. Next slide, please.
So connecting through our stories of transformation, I talked a little bit about this just a second ago, but here is a photo of the poetry readings in person in our downstairs area. And so, yeah, we had a virtual this year. And the virtual one was so great. It was just an example of how adaptable youth are and how they can pivot really well in these situations. And Just trying to be cognizant of time. Dalton, do you want to talk about Chalk Heart?
Yeah, so Chalk Heart is another way that we can engage young people on a different level. So while we engage young people through poetry about stories of transformation, poetry celebration here, we also ask young people around the state to illustrate the poetry that is that the young people have submitted to us. We totally believe that the shortest distance between any 2 points is a story. And so we let young people share their stories and what stories that they're experiencing on a larger scale and amplify their voices. We're a huge believer that we're not giving voices or giving voice to people who are voiceless, but rather giving opportunities for people's voices who've been pushed to the margins to be centered in the conversation around gender-based violence. And then next slide, please.
So the last element, movements rooted in our interdependence across communities and issues. So here in Idaho, the dominant story is that Idaho is conservative, white, and tolerant. But we know that's not true. Just through our youth activists and our staff, we're really challenging that narrative. And, you know, we've been tapping into activists and emerging activists across generations, communities, and social justice issues, ready to work together for another world and a way of being.
Awesome. And so when we think about interdependence across communities and cultures, we talk about showing up for the Women's March, the DACA rally, or the DACA rally that we had when families are being separated by the border, the anniversary of the Women's March, and we continually show up for these communities that are tangentially related, but also very much related to gender-based violence. What we do know is that there's sexual violence happening to children that are being detained at the border, and families and families who are moving here as undocumented immigrants. And we recently can model the intergenerational partnership. Moving fast is the appointment of what is his face? Justice Kavanaugh by, yeah. So we wrote a letter to Christine Blasey Ford and her 15-year-old self, recognizing that it was not her fault, but it required the guidance of young people to draft the letter, but also help young people get access to like the Washington Post, The Hill, and Teen Vogue, and share the impact of what happened, and sharing perspectives of young people from Idaho, of all places. And what we really encourage with our programs and partners where we're providing technical assistance for is that if things like the DACA rally or family separation rallies and narrative changes are happening in Idaho, of all places, where we are highlighted as a most conservative place, as Monet has said, it can happen anywhere. And so we want to be able to encourage young people from across the United States and also young people who are working with young people that the different world is possible and it is already emerging. So I'm a little bit over time. We're gonna take like a 5-minute break for everyone, and then we'll open up to questions at the end of those 5 minutes. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, y'all.
All right, we'll gather back in 1 minute. Welcome back, everyone. So I know we rushed a little bit towards the end. Please feel free to ask us questions in the chat or as you see fit, or or you can just unmute yourself and Monet and I will be happy to answer your questions.
Oh, Dalton, you're muted.
Sorry, I'm talking to Kelly on the other line.
Oh. Okay, so I'll go ahead and start with the first question. Jen from SAS asks, as a volunteer coordinator of a nonprofit in a college town, many of the youth who participate in our program are college students looking to add to their educational requirements. Do you have recommendations for how to reach out to other youth in the community? Yeah, that's a great question. So our youth are high schoolers, like 9th through 12th grade. And then once they graduate, we do like a termination process, which is also really important. And so, yeah, I would suggest reaching out to the high schools, reaching out in places that you know that youth are hanging out. And I know that for us, it just kind of depends on what work you're looking for them to do, and how they kind of hear about it just through word of mouth. I would also do social media campaigns if you're on, any of the social media platforms. I know that is definitely one way that youth are engaged, and that's how they hear about stuff, is basically through social media and their friends. But we definitely get folks who, they talk to a high school teacher or counselor who knows about us, and that's how they find out about our positions. So hopefully that answers your question. And then Megan asked, can you speak more to strategies you have utilized in addressing adultism that comes up from colleagues and our sexual and domestic violence organizations when centering youth work? Yeah, it's a great question too, Megan. So I think that meaningful access guide that I shared earlier, that I'd be happy to share again in the chat, is really helpful in addressing those kinds of issues. And I think a lot of what we do at the Idaho Coalition is just really putting it out there and addressing things as soon as they happen. So if we know that there are adults either on staff or who come through the Idaho Coalition through other ways, are being or sort of projecting adultism, we try to have those open conversations as soon as possible to say, our youth organizers, they're a part of our staff. They are deserving of, having their ideas heard. We treat them like everyone else. and they just, in the sense that they get paid and they do the work, right? And so, yeah, having those open conversations as soon as possible. And then I think that meaningful access guide would really help. Dalton, do you have anything else, maybe from your own personal experience?
Yeah, I think having those open conversations is a great first step, but I think also definitely encouraging young people to have their boundaries. So just when you're onboarding your young people, make them aware that they can always call you out or call you in when someone is being adultist. One thing I think we've learned from our movement is that when we're being called out, it means that we're being canceled. That's not necessarily the case with young people. Young people have modeled this so many times within our organization. We're like, no, that's problematic. That's not going to fly with us. But rather, and they give us so much grace and time with that. And in the same way that we provide grace and time for the young people when they're being problematic, it's like a trust thing. Like, I want to be better and show up for the young people. And so I think the question might be more like, what does it take to be in a better relationship with young people so that we can correct each other in real time when we cause each other harm? Any other questions?
You can type it in the chat or unmute yourself.
Oh, Dalton and Monet, I see that Eli has put a question in the chat, but I got kind of bounced up to the top with some other comments.
Oh, okay, let me see if I can find it. Oh, gotcha. Are the youth hourly or stipend? Right now they're hourly. I think it used to be a stipend, but yeah, they are hourly now. And I think we used to pay them $11 an hour, and now we pay them $15 an hour.
Yeah, since the pandemic started. All right. I think this might be a stopping point. Monet and I will drop our emails in the chat. And if you have any questions that come up for you, like in an hour or two, because sometimes it takes time for me to process, please feel free to reach out to us and we'd be more than happy to answer your questions.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining today.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Dalton and Monet, for joining us today and
Trisha,
for sharing.
And Heidi. I gotta bounce because I have another webinar. Bye.
Oh, bye, Dalton. Yeah, I just want thank you all so much for sharing your stories and your strategies. We really appreciate the work that you lead and your passion and dedication to centering youth in our movements. Dalton and Monet have put their emails in the chat, so if you need to get in touch with them, you can reach out that way. Thank you again to Heidi for providing closed captioning for us. If you need to connect with the Oregon Coalition, Trisha and I will put our emails in the chat. And thanks everyone for joining and taking time to engage with us. We'll talk to you soon.
Bye.